Hi, this is Skip Stewart, Vice President and Chief Improvement Officer with Baptist Memorial Healthcare again. And I'm once again with our good friends, Dr. Edgar Schein and Peter Schein. And we're talking about this thing that we call humble inquiry. But before we jump right into that, I want to kind of touch on something we talked about in the first. And that was, we talked about this thing called a socio-technical system, and that healthcare is arguably one of the most complicated socio-technical systems. But Ed, in that last video, you really talked a little bit about an open socio-technical system. Could you elaborate a little more about what you mean by the word open?
Well, let's just take the example of a hospital. A hospital has many components, subsystems, and each of these subsystems exists in a different environment of its own. The doctors exist in their professional environment. The pharmacy exists in the world of pharmacy. Each of those environments impacts the hospital in its own way. So even though the hospital is one system, it is impacted by multiple environments that deal with all the different subsystems of that hospital. And that makes it not only open, but unstable and perpetually changing, which is the most important point to remember about systems, that they are open and perpetually changing.
The other thing, Skip, that I could add quickly is the idea of if your metaphor for a system is a machine or a human. And so our primary metaphor for a system is a human. The human is an open system. It's very adaptive. It responds to inputs, and it's predictable, but it's not fixed. And so I think it's important when people are thinking about complex systems to always lean toward an organic metaphor, because these days that's more realistic than the sort of well-oiled machine metaphor, which was very popular in the last century. But we just don't think that really is the right way to think about complicated systems these days.
That makes a lot of sense. That makes a real lot of sense. Well, let me kind of shift the conversation at this point. We've talked a lot about the importance of relationships within these complex interdependent systems and how humble inquiry is a way to help build those relationships. For our purposes, could you provide some type of a working definition of what do we mean when we say humble inquiry?
Yeah, let me start, Skip, by noting that we do have a nice description of this in the book. I think you alerted me that it's on page 3.
I think that's right.
But in that we talk about it as an art and an attitude. So we'll touch on those, but I also want to just kind of set the table in this way, that to sort of break down the two words. First, humble, in our mind, that could mean something that's a personality trait or a spiritual trait or a spiritual value, but it doesn't have to. Everybody is humble in the way that we like to define it, as it's kind of an action state at work. And what it means is that you embrace the fact that you don't have all the answers. You're humble to the information that you don't know. You're vulnerable to the information that you don't know. And if you accept that and you embrace that, you're going to end up going through a workday learning more than maybe more than you expected, and certainly learning more that will help you make better decisions, because that's what medicine's all about. That's what business is all about, is making better decisions. So humble means embrace that reality that you don't have the answers, and the people around you collectively know more than you do, and your job as a leader is to draw that information out to allow people to make better decisions. And so an inquiry is about the distinction between going through your day, drawing people out, drawing this information out, rather by asking questions. And one simple way to think about this is you're asking questions that you don't know the answer to. Because we're very good at leading the witness. We're very good at asking questions that we kind of know the answer to and we want to box somebody in. Well, this is the opposite of that. This is asking questions that you don't know the answer to. And in that process, increasing that sphere of information that's going to allow you to make better decisions. The contrast that it is to, asking, which is what humble inquiry is about, versus telling, which is just sort of going in and, shooting your mouth and telling people what you know. And what that does is it ends up drawing a box around that information sphere, because you're either forcing somebody to agree with you or disagree with you. It sets the wrong tone. It's not an open tone, it's a closed tone. So with that, that's kind of the table we like to set around what humble inquiry really means. And Ed, do you want to add to that?
I think the point will come out when we discuss the 4 levels of relationship. So are you ready for that? Or
Well, that was perfect timing, Ed. Yeah, that was my next question. You were able to predict me pretty well. You talk a lot about relationships, and relationship can be a broad word, but both in Humble Inquiry and many of the other books that you've written, you talk about 4 different levels of a relationship, kind of on a continuum, and you even encourage that we strive for a certain level because of these critical interdependencies. Can you give us some understanding about those 4 levels?
yeah, I think this is one of our major points in this whole field, that we all agree that relationships are important, but we don't specify what level we mean. So the level which we call -1, because it's a negative relationship, is what we call domination. This is the professor in the old style medical school who dominates his first year anatomy students. And they know that all they can do is kowtow and say, yes, sir, because if they don't, he will take advantage of them. It's the sweatshop where the boss has all the control. It's the prison guard over the prisoner. That does exist, but it's not a good vehicle for communication, because the person being told stuff is motivated to sabotage, to not listen, to get back for having been subjugated. So that has led most societies into what we can think of as transactional relationships, where we know what our role is. The boss knows his or her role, the doctor knows his or her role, the nurse, the tech, and we communicate by playing out those roles as we have learned them. They usually involve being psychologically distant, and unfortunately, they also involve, in that distance, that there is no particular incentive for the person in the subordinate role, if it's a boss-subordinate relationship and it's transactional, there is no incentive to tell the boss what you really know. It's psychologically distant. You do your job. You get instructions. If you've misunderstood the instructions and do the wrong thing, that's too bad, but it's intrinsic to that relationship. And it's the flaws in that relationship that lead us to advocating that you need to personalize. You need to get to know the person with whom you're talking. And that's where humble inquiry, of course, comes in. One way to get to know for the subordinate to get to know the boss and for the boss to get to know the people that report to her, you have to reveal personal things and ask personal questions. And why do you have to do that? Because you have to open the channel of communication and you have to obligate each other to tell each other what you know in order to get the job done better. It's not enough to know and not speak. You have to know and speak to get the information together to get the job done. Now, if the interdependency is very extreme, the doctor and the anesthetist in a very complex operation, you may even need level 3, which is a more intimate relationship, which you see in SEALs teams out doing a mission or other groups where the interdependence is so high their lives depend on each other. And in those instances, they not only get to know each other personally, but they get to know each other very deeply because of this interdependence. So we're not advocating that, but we are advocating that you at least have to get personal enough by inquiring and by revealing to establish the relationship that you each will tell each other what you know, and you will each learn to trust each other to get the job done better. Those are the 4 levels, and level 2 is the ideal one that we should all shoot for with humble inquiry.
Wow, that's really good. So level 2 is what we're striving for. Do you also find that there are times when in your work that people might think that they have a level 2 where things are personalized and but reality is it's only a level 1?
Well, the question was asked of us in the other way. Can you fake level 2? And the answer is no, you can't. If one person is transactional and the other person wants to build the relationship, but the transactional person is just pretending, being nice, and stuff, the other person will see through that immediately. And the person who's trying to fake it will be worse off because he or she will be building mistrust.
Yeah, I was going to add that, we really try to characterize level 2 and subsequently level 3 as built on a foundation of openness and trust. Openness and trust. And those are 2 things you can't really fake. Right?
Gotcha.
You can't really fake trust.
Right.
I mean, people try, but humans are pretty sensitive to that level of disingenuous or deceit. So openness and trust is that platform, and just the other thing that gets brought up, I just want to add quickly, is the people often will be a little uncomfortable with the idea of level 3, that sort of intimacy. On the other hand, when we've described it as professional intimacy, like you might see on a successful sports team, or you might see it, as Ed mentioned, in high performance teams in the military, we know that there are lots of high performance teams in medicine or, in lots of forms of work where there is a degree of connection to each other, that they can quickly switch roles or they can finish each other's sentences. So that idea of professional intimacy really appeals to people when we describe these levels. It goes beyond level 2. It's maybe not what we think of as a love relationship in the sort of highest form of intimacy in level 3. So we often say that maybe level 2.5 is the sweet spot.
I remember something that you helped me with, Peter, that I'll share with our audience is I remember asking you a question about, I've seen leaders ask their people for ideas and suggestions and feedback, and many times it's very common to see no response. I always say you can hear crickets. And I remember asking once, I wonder why that is. And you said, well, think about it, Skip. If there's only a level one relationship, what does the person have to gain? They have more to lose than they have to gain. But when there's a level two relationship, I love this statement that you provided me, Peter, is you're trying to get answers to questions that have never been asked. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah. Or maybe the contrast is if you're the boss, you can ask a question and get an answer. But if you're a level two boss, you're getting answers to questions you haven't asked.
That's great. That's great. Well, let me provide a little bit of a story, because if I understand what you're saying, we're not just arguing for relationships that they're important in these interdependencies just because they're good and humane. We're really arguing because there's always some form of risk connected to them. And I was recently shared this story, and I'd love to hear your comments. I'm going to read it just so I don't miss anything. It was from another healthcare system, but it was told to me like this. There was a young 12-year-old boy came into the ER after a fall at school. Now, Dr. Smith, in his first year of ER medicine, had ordered an X-ray of the boy's wrist. Ashley, the radiology technologist, after looking at the boy's hand and doing this job for over 20 years, was convinced that the boy had a broken bone in his hand. Now, even though she should have questioned the order for only an X-ray of the wrist, recently Dr. Smith, on a completely different issue, had communicated that she was not a doctor and was not to question his decision-making process. Unfortunately, after a few weeks of the boy being in pain, he returned, and it was discovered that he did have a broken hand and surgery was needed. Now, 10 years later, the young man still deals with aching pain in his right hand. What are your thoughts on that in regards to what we've been talking about?
Well, the level two issue is not just open and trusting, but obligation to each other. When you know something that's relevant, how hard do you have to work on making sure the other party knows what you know? So the question in this story is, what did the tech who believed in the broken wrist do that would have been truly helpful or didn't do?
Yeah, and we often say that we set up that dynamic that if you see something, you say something. But then you get into that contrast of, well, not if there's no what's referred to as psychological safety. There has to be psychological safety for somebody to be willing, if they see something, to say something. And this seems like a classic example where she saw something, but the relationship that she had with the doctor or the surgeon didn't have that level of psychological safety, that level of openness and trust, that she felt free to say something. In fact, wasn't she told really effectively not to say anything, just to respond to orders?
That's right.
And the thing that often comes up for us when we're thinking about healthcare is that this was a broken bone, but what if it was a heart attack? When you're, or aneurysm, a cranial, incident, where you're talking about life and death. And so it just seems so critical that what's the barrier to creating that openness and trust, given that you know what the benefit of it might be in the case of life and death, or even complicated surgery that isn't life and death, but as in this case, has long-term consequences if you get it wrong.
That's right. That's right. So
I want to make one other point that's so relevant to medicine, and that is how truthful we have to be within the peer group. When a doctor makes a mistake, do fellow doctors really tell him or her? And if a doctor consistently makes mistakes, do they actually drum him or her out of the profession? Or do they drop back to level 1 transactional? Well, that's a little embarrassing. Not only will we not fire him or her, but if he or she leaves, we won't even say in the letter of recommendation that this person is unreliable. I think that's a deep problem that requires level 2 honesty, which most lawyers, doctors, they all face that problem of what do we say to our peers when we see them doing something very wrong.
Great point.
And actually, Skip, if I can just add one more thing onto that, it's sort of this contrast between where we're very good at sort of logging failure, right? Failure is a discrete threshold, but success and improvement is a continuum. It's shades of gray, and you want improvement to move you up that continuum. You didn't fail, but it could have gone better.
No.
And the idea of sort of building this level of openness and trust is so that you obviously you're going to be measured whether you fail or not. But what's much more important for the well-being of the hospital and the community is that idea that you're continually improving, getting to higher levels of success, than rather than just avoiding failure.
Great point. Great point. Well, on that note, we'll bring this video to a close. And on the third video that we're going to get into, and maybe even third or fourth, we're going to talk about some different stories of both humble inquiry and humble attitude. And y'all are going to provide some of these stories, and I'll kind of bring them up and let you kind of tell the story. So until then, thank you so much, Ed and Peter, for your time today.
Thank you, Skip.
Our pleasure.